So here's an interesting question for you. What do you know about blended learning? What's wild is that I'd be willing to bet that you know a whole heck of a lot about it, especially if you spend any time teaching through the pandemic. Us pandemic-tested teachers were creating blended learning opportunities for our students left and right. But let's kind of review what the core principles of blended learning are really all about. First of all, one of the best sources for learning more about blended learning is the Blended Learning Universe website. You can find that online just by hitting up the Google machine. And what the Blended Learning website will tell you is that good blended learning is learning that happens part online, part in a supervised brick and mortar location, read your classroom, and it's always an integrated learning experience. Now, that part online element oftentimes means students do some of the work at home, but it can also mean that students are doing some of the work online within your own classroom, just not being directed by a teacher through an activity. The real key about the online component in a blended learning space is that it allows us to give students some control over the time and the place, or the path and the pace of their learning. And that's really important. There's an element of agency involved that you don't oftentimes see in traditional teacher lessons. I'm really happy to see the part in a supervised brick and mortar location on the Blended Learning Universe's website, simply because it means that we're still important as classroom teachers in schools. Like, this isn't about just kind of creating an online curriculum for students to consume on their own. We still believe that teachers play a phenomenal role, or an incredibly important role, in the education of kids, and so do their peers. We don't believe that kids can learn independently on their own just because we believe in blended learning. But the key is, and this is something a bunch of teachers sometimes get wrong, is the key is that that online component and the in-person component of learning have to be an integrated learning experience. Now, what does that mean, that it's an integrated learning experience? It means that when we ask students to complete something in the online portion of learning, we shouldn't simply be reviewing or reteaching that exact same work when they're in the brick and mortar face-to-face portion of a blended learning experience. Instead, the work that we do in the brick and mortar experience should build on what students did in their online portion of learning, or reverse that. The work that students do online in their blended learning experience should build on things that we've done together in the brick and mortar space. Does that make sense? It's not just about delivering content to kids online and then reviewing that content when they come back to school. It's more than that. Now, another thing that blended learning is it's not just a tech-rich environment. It's not just using technology to teach children. And the reason for that is because just using technology to teach children isn't all that new or revolutionary. I mean, ask your students. They're not super motivated by technology in the way that we think they might be. Instead, what blended learning is really about for the students is introducing tools that can give them some element of control over their own learning. Remember, that's the time and place, path and pace portion of blended learning. We want to create opportunities for students to have agency over their own learning. Are you with me? Now, think to yourself for a quick second about what you think some of the strengths would be in using blended learning as an instructional model. If you have to, hit pause so that you have a moment to process. Maybe take some notes for yourself. What do you think the advantages of blended learning as an instructional model really are? I'll pause for a second, but remember, if you need more time to think, just hit pause on your web browser. Okay, so oftentimes when I ask that question, when I say why blended learning, people will say, well, because students are motivated by using technology in instruction. Or they'll say because independent study motivates kids. And those things aren't necessarily untrue, but I don't think they're the real advantage of blended learning. What I personally believe the real advantage of blended learning is that blended learning experiences free up the teachers to do more targeted work with our learners. The other advantage of blended learning is it allows us to more frequently integrate higher leverage instructional practices into our classrooms. So this is really about taking a traditional learning environment where maybe you're in charge of everything, where you're delivering lessons to students day by day for the entire 50 minutes or 4 hours that you have your kids in your care. Oftentimes in those environments, you're not really ever freed up to work with smaller groups of learners who have unique needs. In a blended learning space, we're deliberately trying to free you up to do more of that work. And if you want to know how impactful that can really be, let's take a look at the research of John Hattie. John Hattie is trying to document the impact of all of the strategies that we use in our classrooms with our kids. And at this point, he's gathered enough research to rank 250 different strategies. And he ranks them in order from those strategies that have the potential to accelerate learning all the way down to things that we do in the classroom that have a negative impact on students as learners. And I just wanted you to see, first of all, so that I can reinforce that notion to you that technology alone is not the reason why we embrace blended learning. I just wanted you to see what web-based learning ranks in Hattie's ranking. It's a 0.18. Now, what do those numbers mean? Well, Hattie calls 0.4 the hinge point. So it's a strategy that can give us 1 year's growth for 1 year of use, as long as we're using the strategy correctly. What's interesting is web-based learning is a 0.18. That doesn't mean that it has a negative impact on students as learners, but it means that if we use web-based learning and web-based learning alone, students won't even make 1 year's worth of growth for 1 year's worth of use. Isn't that interesting? Now, I want you to look at the rest of those strategies that are on that particular list. So anything in Hattie's ranking that's a 0.4 or higher is 1 year's worth of growth for 1 year's worth of use, as long as we use it correctly. Anything higher than a 0.4 in Hattie's ranking has the potential to accelerate learning. We can move students forward more than 1 year for 1 year's use. And so if you take a look at that particular graphic, things like small group learning can be a part of a blended learning experience, or classroom discussion can be a part of a blended learning experience, or having the opportunity for a teacher to provide targeted feedback to kids. That is something we can do as a result of a good blended learning experience, or freeing teachers up to respond to intervention, to provide targeted support to students who need it. That can be a part of a good blended learning experience. And then, of course, student self-efficacy can be built through a good blended learning experience. So what I want you to realize here is that the technology is not the key in the blended learning experience. Instead, the key is freeing the teachers up to use more higher leverage strategies in their classrooms with their kids on a more regular basis. Now, that's just the point I'm trying to make to you on this particular slide. Please understand that blended learning, when well done, gives you the opportunity to create more higher leveraged or integrate more higher leverage teaching strategies or instructional practices into the work that you do. That's what makes blended learning so important. It's not the technology, it's not the independent study, and it's not even really the student agency, the voice and choice, although that is an important part of the blended learning model. The real important part of the blended learning model is rethinking how we use the time that we have with our students in our classrooms. Does that make sense to you? All right, looking forward to talking with you more about what blended learning is and how it works.